There we go, we're live. Hi everyone, welcome to our author chat with Peter May. Do you want to start us off, Peter, with an intro to you and your books?
Well, my name's Peter May. I'm Scottish, as most people can probably tell. I don't have to say too much for that to become apparent. I live in France, though. I am also now a French citizen, which means I also have still my European membership, so I can travel about freely. Unlike you people in Britain, ha ha ha. Yeah, I started off life as a journalist, 8 years as a journalist, and then I went into television as a scriptwriter, story editor, script editor, and latterly producer. And I worked in television for 17 years. And then I gave up TV to try and make a living writing books. That was hard going, difficult. It's very difficult to make a living writing books, as probably hundreds or even thousands of writers out there will tell you. It takes a lot of hard work, and you need a lot of luck. Ultimately, after a lot of bad luck, I was finally lucky and made my breakthrough with a book called The Black House, which had originally been rejected by every publisher in Britain, and languished in a drawer for 5 years before it was finally published here in France in translation, where it was hugely well received, and then finally published in the UK after being taken up by almost every other country in the world. It then turned into the Lewis trilogy, and I've now written, I think, 31 books. So this new book, The Black Loch, returns to the characters that we first encountered in the Lewis trilogy, primarily Finn and Marsley. And it also takes us back to the Isle of Lewis. People have been clamoring for years for me to do this, and I've always said no, because I felt that I had told their story in the trilogy, that I didn't really have anything more to say about them. However, 12 years or so on, there was something fresh to say, and I've returned to them, and people have said, well, is this the fourth book in the trilogy? And I always say, well, there are only 3 books in a trilogy. You can't have 4 books in a trilogy. I think a quartet of books is called a tetralogy, believe it or not. But this isn't. The trilogy hasn't become a tetralogy. The Black Loch is what I like to think of as a sequel to the trilogy. It's revisiting those people and those stories in that place 12 years later. So that's where I'm at.
Excellent. Douglas Adams, I think, has got about 5 books in his Hitchhiker's trilogy.
Oh, yes.
So you can add more. It's fine.
Yeah, I'm sure that'll be the last.
We've already got a hello from Donna. She says she's really looking forward to this chat.
Well, hi, Donna. Yeah, well, I hope you enjoy it. It was a long time in the gestation. It goes back to really 2020, or really probably 2019, when I was working on an idea for a book which was going to be set in the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard in the Arctic Circle. And there were 2 elements in that book to the story, and one of them was about climate change. And the other element of the story was that I'd taken Finn's son, Fionlach, now grown up, working on Svalbard, accused of murder, and Finn coming to the archipelago to try and prove his son's innocence. So that's the book I was planning. I'd done a huge amount of research on the location. I had the location research trip all booked up for May 2020. All my hotels, my interviews. I had an interview lined up with the governor of Svalbard. It was all set. And then, of course, a certain thing called COVID appeared on the scene and put all our lives on hold. My trip to Svalbard was cancelled. I had to abandon the book. And it was really probably about a year after that I took the climate change element of that story and redeveloped it and set it in Scotland in the year 2051. And that came out last year. It was called A Winter Grave. And you know, at that point, I thought, oh, gosh, I've written 30 books. I've had a long career writing books. I've had a long career in television. I've had a long career as a journalist. It's time I put my feet up and started taking things a bit easy. So I had no plans to write another book at that stage. But this Finn Fionlach storyline that I had kind of worked out for the Svalbard book was squirreling around in my brain. I couldn't get rid of it. You know, I'd wake up in the middle of the night and there it was. And eventually I gave in and I thought, I've got to write this. But I couldn't. The moment for going to Svalbard for me had passed. So really, I thought, I mean, I guess the revelation for me was, well, you know, let's just take this story thread and plant it back on the Isle of Lewis, where it all began, where we first met these people. And that kind of opened the door for me. And I went back to the island last year, just about a year ago, just now, and did my research for it and spent the winter writing it. And it was an interesting journey for me, revisiting old characters, revisiting old locations, and quite traumatic in some ways. And the research was certainly very illuminating and has kind of coloured my view of quite a number of things. But yeah, the book's out on 12th of September, and I know people have been looking for this follow-up to the trilogy for a good number of years, but wait no longer. It's with us.
Svalbard has one of the global seed banks, doesn't it, where they keep
Seed bank, yeah. I actually tried to get access to that. I tried to arrange a visit to it because I'd read that people had visited it, and in fact, I watched video of a guy who had been in the seed bank, an American, I think, or Canadian, and they said, no, we don't allow visitors anymore, which was very disappointing to me because it offered a lot of interesting story potential, I thought.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm.
Especially with the kind of stories you write, because they always have a hint to the climate or the effect of climate change.
Yeah, and where I was, one of the things that one of the places I was going to go in Svalbard was their old. I mean, the Soviets, you know, did a lot of coal mining in Svalbard. And there are old abandoned Soviet coal mines and all these tunnels, and there's a whole big place which is just deserted. All the buildings you can go in, and the desks are still there, pencils lying on them. You know, it's just they just uproots and off they went and left it just as it was, and that was going to be quite an important location in the story that I was planning to tell, which will never now be told. But there you go.
You say you were retiring last time I spoke to you. That was the last book you were writing.
Yeah, well, you know, I've retired again. My wife doesn't believe me, and it's true that if you'd asked me 15 months ago, if I was retired and that if I was going to write something else, I'd have said, I'm not going to write another book. I'm finished now. And here I am talking about my new book. So I have no plans for another book, but never say never.
Well, as someone who started my journey reading your books with the initial Hebrides trilogy, I'm very glad you did return. Because I'm probably one of those people who's been champing at the bit for years to get another one.
Yeah, I think I might have had communications from you in the past saying, when are we going to have some more Finn?
Quite possibly, because they're really unique books, aren't they? I think in crime fiction in general, partly because of the location, partly because of the way you weave in the effects of climate change, which I don't think was really being done when you started writing the Hebrides trilogy, and just like the characters as well were so outstanding in those that it's quite nice to return and see what's happened to them so many years
Yeah,
later.
well, it's interesting how things changed because, I wrote the Lewis Man, the Black House in 2004, and and I'd chosen the location, the Isle of Lewis, because I'd spent half of the 90s filming there and living on the island while we were producing a series in the Gaelic language called Macha. And I'd got to know the place really, really, really well. But, to most people in the UK, it's somewhere very far away. It's way out there somewhere. And kind of arcane, strange. People speak another language, and the customs are not really reflected elsewhere in the UK. So it seemed to me like a really good location, an unusual location, and something that might appeal to people elsewhere. This is part of the country we live in, but don't know very well. So let's explore it. And I wrote that book, and it was in some senses it was more than just a crime story. It was a kind of the novel I'd always wanted to write, but it was also a crime story. And crime provides a fantastic pretext and platform for writers to explore anything they want, really. Because crime is all about an exploration of the human condition, and that's what writers do, explore the human condition. So it's an ideal pretext for getting into anything you want to write about. And so I wanted to write about things that had come from my childhood, my relationship with a little girl that I first met at school, my first day at school, lived on a farm, and I knew that became the relationship between Finn and Marshley when they were kids. And I wanted to explore themes like regret, arriving at a certain point in your life and looking back and thinking, I wish I hadn't done that. I wish I hadn't said that. But of course, you can't take these things back. You just have to live with them and deal with them somehow. So these were themes that I wanted to explore. And of course, I wanted to explore that location. And I so it was a departure for me, because up until then I'd been writing the China thrillers, so very much kind of in classic thriller style, but set in China. So it was very different from that, and I guess I'd taken quite a risk at the time. But I thought it had paid off, because I thought it was the best thing I'd written, and then I couldn't get it published. Nobody wanted to publish it. I got rejection letter after rejection letter. right across the winter, the following winter, and I was in some measure of despair. I have to say, I couldn't understand. They all said lovely things in the best rejection letters I've ever had. You know, you could have taken quotes from them and put them on the back of the book. You know, and you would have wanted to buy that book, but they didn't want to publish it. And so that was very disheartening. And you know, it was another 5, 6, 7 years before the book actually came out in English. And people asked me at the time, well, why did publishers reject it? And it's interesting because you look back and you think, well, why did they? Because the books became so successful. I mean, worldwide. And the only thing that I could think of was that, you know, at the time I was writing this, it was really before the big invasion of Scandi Noir, and British publishing was a little bit out of step with that. It hadn't really caught up with where that was going and where it was taking readers, and readers loved it. You know, the Larson books, and I think you know, those books dealt with dark psychological stories that were set in dark, cold places. And in a way, that's what I had written in The Black House. And I don't think British publishers were quite ready for that. But, you know, six years down the line, 7 years down the line, the Scandinavians had broken the ground, and suddenly the British publishing industry was open to it. I think readers would always have been open to it because I think readers are miles ahead of publishers. And so you know, it was, and you know, the reason it was first published in France rather than the UK was because the French have a genre called le roman noir, which is literally the black novel, and it's like they regard crime as literature, and the roman noir they regard as being like a novel, where it's a crime novel, and in a way that genre didn't really exist in the UK at that time, and but the Black House fell very neatly into that genre. So they published it with they were very happy to publish it. They bought English language rights, which is unheard of for a French publisher to buy English language rights, or world rights in a book written in English. It was a phenomenon in lots of ways. And I, you know, with the rest of the trilogy, when I carried on the theme of writing about things from my own life. You know, in the Lewis Man, one of the main characters is an old man who suffers from dementia, and we get an insight into what's going on in his mind in sort of first-person passages, and that was very much based on my father. There's a scene in the book where, because the old man is Marshally's father, where Marsally comes to visit her parents, and finds her father sitting on a chair in the house with his hat and his coat on, and a suitcase sitting on the floor beside him. And our mother says, "Take him away. I can't deal with him anymore." And that's exactly what happened to me. I returned from filming up on Lewis after production one year and went to see my parents, and there was my dad sitting with his coat and his hat on and his suitcase, and my mother said to me, I can't deal with him, take him away. And I did, and he became from that moment my responsibility, and he was suffering quite badly from dementia by this time, and my mother never set eyes on him again. They never saw one another again. You know, so that was quite a traumatic experience in my own life, and I got to know my father probably better than I ever had previously, even although he was suffering from dementia. And I think, I like to think, quite an insight into the way that his mind was working in its troubled way, which is what I wanted to write about in The Lewis Man. So these things are important to me as I'm writing, that I'm writing from truth and from the heart and from my own experience.
Is that I learned what a black house was reading the first
Yeah.
I've not heard the term before. Is the title for this one a kind of a nod to the title of the first?
In a way, yes. It's a kind of echo of that first one, The Black House, the Black Loch. There are in Scotland several Black Lochs in reality. It's not an uncommon name, so it seemed, although the one that in the book is fictitious, it was definitely an echo of that original title, and sort of paid kind of, it was a little nod to that, yes.
I'm trying to think what we can ask about without giving away spoilers. There's lots of people saying in the book saying they're never going to eat salmon again.
Yeah. This was, excuse me. This was something I didn't set out particularly to write about the salmon industry. I wanted to create within my story references to the past and an incident when Finn and some of his pals in their teen years were involved in an incident at a fish farm. And we're going back to the 90s. And I knew from, at that time on the Isle of Lewis, fish farming was a very small industry. It was almost like an extension of crofting. People very often had little salmon cages in bits of water, but small lochs at the end of their croft. It wasn't what it is now. Now it's an international multi-billion-dollar industry. But back then it was all very small scale and naive, and so I wanted to do research into that, the background, the early fish farming, and all the rest of it. So I embarked on my research, and my research led me to discover that the fish farming that had begun at that time had evolved into something which was really quite worrying, particularly if you're eating salmon. They call it aquaculture now, the basically breeding fish for consumption in a farmed way. And the cages they keep these salmon in are huge things, but they are crammed with millions of fish. I mean, overcrowded beyond belief, and they are bedeviled with all sorts of problems. Sea lice, which spread, and the sea lice attach to the fish and start eating them alive, effectively. There are other diseases. The effluent and pollution that is created by these farms is horrendous, and they're always situated in ecologically fragile waters, and do enormous amounts of damage. But that it turns out that fish in the cages are dying. I mean, there were something like last year, something like 25 or 30 million salmon died in the cages prior to harvesting, and they are kept in inhuman, in salmon conditions, maltreated, diseased, and the supposed government controls are extremely lax, because the government doesn't want to inhibit this industry in any way, because salmon is the largest food export from the UK. It's worth more than £500 million a year. So they don't want to mess that up. They don't want to interfere with that. But there are, I discovered, activists out there who are trying to draw to public attention what's going on. And so I made contact with several of these people, and I got access to videos that they had taken, which just, I mean, turned my stomach, frankly. I mean, I saw the most horrific things. I'm not going to describe in detail here, but you know, it just meant, and I like salmon, but it meant I was never going to eat salmon again. Certainly not farmed salmon. You know, wild salmon from the river, but that's very, very rare. Or North Atlantic wild salmon. I don't know, but farmed salmon, I will never eat again. I mean, that's a choice for anybody to make, and I've made my choice, but only because I was exposed to the realities of modern aquaculture.
There's an even more kind of evocative look back to fishing as well in the story, isn't there? Of like people who were fishing off the coast of like Argentina. Was that a
Yeah, the whaling. There was another. It was a. I mean, obviously, there's the fish farming element of the story in the Black Loch. Another element that kind of forced its way into my consciousness as I was storylining it, was because I was watching items on the news last year about a mass stranding of pilot whales on the east coast of Lewis. More than 50 of them washed up on the shore. And they all died. They didn't manage to save any of them. And people tried desperately hard to do it. And it was a mystery why on earth did these things come ashore and washed up. And of course, it transpired that pilot whales live in these huge family groups called pods, which can be anywhere between 50 and 100 whales, and they are absolutely devoted to each other and will sacrifice for each other. If one of them is in trouble, the rest will sacrifice themselves for that one. And they thought that this is what had happened in that stranding on Lewis last year, that one of the females had got into difficulties giving birth and had come ashore, and the rest had come to try and help or support her in some way and got washed up on the beach with the tide and couldn't get back off. And so this sense of family and sacrifice really chimed with me because it was one of the themes of my story. And so I recreated a fictitious stranding of whales in the book. And I obviously, to do that, I did a lot of research into whaling. I discovered, because I'd gone to the island and I talked to the island vet who had to put down the remaining whales. They had to be euthanized, which had really quite traumatized him. And he'd referred to a time when he had first come back to the island from his training elsewhere, his experience elsewhere, and when there was the odd stranding of whales, he would refer to the old whalers who lived in Ness. And I did some research into this and discovered that there was a community of men who in the 50s and 60s travelled from the island and other parts of Scotland every year down to South Georgia and the Sandwich Islands, which is really just north of Antarctica in the South Atlantic, and they hunted whales and they killed them in vast numbers because there was a market for all sorts of things, products that could be obtained from whales, everything from women's corsets to oil for lamps and all sorts of things. And they would spend 6, 7, 8 months a year living on these islands in very primitive conditions, or on the whaling boats themselves. And then they would come back during the winter season down there, which is the summer season in the north, and then return again the following winter. And I found a lot of accounts from Scots who had gone down to South Georgia as part of the group of men whaling down there. I mean, it's a big international settlement. There was stuff that people from all over Europe, men from all over Europe, went down there. I saw some interesting photographs of the place and the various ports that they'd established on these islands. Pretty bleak living conditions. And the factory ships that processed the whales and the blood and the killing and everything actually, I mean, it's quite shocking, absolutely shocking. That in turn led me on to something else that stuff I never used. I never used any of this in the book but it was just part of doing the research, leads you deeper into things. I discovered that that in the Faroe Islands, there's an annual ceremony in which they lure a pod of pilot whales into a bay, and as they come ashore, the men wade out with big knives and cut their throats and bleed them out in the water, and the water turns crimson. I've seen footage of this. It's quite horrendous. And then they drag the carcasses of the whales ashore, and I saw video of children playing among the carcasses of these dead creatures, jumping over them, on them. And it was one of those things that turned my stomach as I was sitting watching this at my desk. It's called the Grind, spelled Grind. And they justify it by saying, "Oh, we need it for food." They don't. But it's just I mean, research is one of the things that has always fascinated me, and I always do a lot of research for all my books, and it leads you down roads that you perhaps never anticipated traveling. And it's one of the things that I really most enjoy about the whole process of writing.
It's I did know about the Faroe Islands whaling, but I didn't know that about the people from Lewis kind of sailing down to Antarctica. Well, we've got a question from Donna. She said, "Is the excitement for this release as high as it was at the start of your author career?"
Well, I get excited about every book coming out. You always have very high hopes. You're always very optimistic. I mean, I guess I spent a lot of time over the winter. I worked very hard on this book. I really wanted, because the trilogy had been so successful and had been regarded so highly, I felt that I had something to live up to. So I kind of really pulled out all the stops on it. And so, yes, I have very high hopes for it. I'm very excited about it coming out. I very much hope that everybody who loved the trilogy and enjoyed the trilogy will enjoy this, and that people who haven't read the trilogy will still enjoy it and be motivated to go back and read the trilogy. So yes, I'm very excited about it.
Did you yeah, because it must be a sense of responsibility to go back to Finn and Marsali and tell their story now. Did you always know where they would be?
No.
No.
I had no idea really what had happened to them. I kind of always sensed that, it wasn't a kind of and they lived happily ever after kind of story. But I hadn't thought in any detail about where they went and what had happened to them until I decided to write this book, and I had to sit down and start thinking about it in some detail and imagine what had gone on in the last 12 years, what kind of career path Finn had gone down, because he'd left the police during the trilogy. He was no longer a detective. And what had become of Marsali, and obviously their son Fionlach, who'd got married at a young age because he'd in the very first book in the Black House he'd got 16-year-old girl pregnant, and ended up marrying her and having children. So yeah, that was a challenge. It was an interesting challenge. It was a fun challenge. It was a creative challenge to work all that out and then bring all that history and all their individual and collective story threads out of the past and into the present, so that it all knitted together for me to be able to tell this story.
Without No, I can't answer you that question because it gives away a spoiler. My dad says he's just about to start the Black Clock.
Right.
Well, I think of how I can word the question in a way that doesn't give away anything. It's really hard, this one, because there is so much that you can't give away, isn't there? You know, without sort of spoiling the reading experience for everyone. I kind of feel like there's not much you can give away.
Well, the only thing that I say, I talk about the background to the book, the history of it. I talk about the story elements, the fish farming, the whale stranding, but those are not the actual story. The actual story is, we find out this right at the beginning of the book, so it doesn't give anything away. The story is that Fionlach, Finn and Marcelly's son, having spent some years in Glasgow, has returned with his wife and child to live on the island and is teaching at the secondary school in Stornoway, the Nicholson Institute, and is accused of murdering one of his former pupils. And it's the shock of that brings Finn and Marcelly back to the island to try and prove their son's innocence. So that effectively was the story element that I had planned for Svalbard. Fionlach was going to be working as a young scientist in Svalbard and accused of murdering somebody, and Finn coming to the archipelago to try and clear his son's name. So that story element, that's where it all begins, and the rest of the book unravels from that point. So I can't really, we can't really talk about the story in much detail beyond that, but
no. Which is where, like, I can't ask my question. So that's because he's a science teacher at the Nicholson rather than being a scientist working.
Is it science? Gosh, I don't remember now what his subject was. Was it science?
Yeah, I thought he was a science teacher.
It could have been.
We'll say he is. We like science teachers.
Yes. Yeah. Well, do we? Yeah. Science. I didn't like my science teachers. I was rotten at science. I abandoned science as soon as I could. Physics and chemistry, I hated those. That, along with mathematics, were my pet hates. So English and art, these were the things that I liked, and history, because history is just about stories, and great stories.
Yeah, I was a fan of history at school. I teach science, so I was being.
You teach science, do you?
Yeah.
Ah, well, maybe if you'd been my science teacher, you would have got me interested in
it. And we could hope. Donna has asked, going away from this one for a minute, Donna has said, you said the last Enzo book was the final one. Is that really true? Because they're her favourite series.
The Nightgate? Yes. I mean, really, I'd written the last Enzo book. The last Enzo book was Cast Iron, because that was the series that I had planned. I'd always planned to write this series of books, where he's solving these cold cases, and and it all came to a head and a conclusion in the 6th book, Cast Iron. And as far as I was concerned, that was it. It was finished, done for. And it was only because I'd had to abandon the Svalbard book, and I was stuck here because of lockdown, but still with a contract with my publisher to produce a book, that I wrote The Nightgate, because the story was going to take place in this area around here where I live. So I didn't need to travel to do research. Well, we were in the middle of lockdown anyway. I couldn't. And part of the story is set, goes back in time to the Second World War. Well, I could do all that research on the internet. And I knew all the locations locally that I was going to use for the book. So, and the thing was that, I needed an investigator for my story. And it just came to me, well, I don't need to create a new investigator. I've got one. He just lives, an hour down the road in Cahors. He's called Enzo MacLeod, and he's retired. But I can bring him out of retirement to investigate this crime, this story. So that's what I did. So it was an adjunct, an add-on to the Enzo Files series. That took me by surprise as much as Enzo, so there won't be any more Enzos. No.
I'm sure people will be thinking that now you've returned to the Hebrides, will there be any more in that new series?
No. I don't think so. As I said, I have no plans to write anything again ever. But I did say that before. So who knows what the future might bring. But I have no contract. I mean, I've turned down all contracts from my publisher. Because I spent a great many years writing, a book a year after year, sometimes two, always to contracts, always to deadlines, always under pressure. So you're writing away, and that's like 6 months of the year you're involved in that, and the other 6 months of the year you're involved in promotion, and promotion takes you, well, it's taken me all over the world, in North America, the Antipodes, all over Europe. So I'm, it kind of, it's like mileage on a car. I feel like one of an old banger. My tires are a bit threadbare, and the mileometer is it's on its second turn round, and the carburetor's leaking, and probably needs a new engine. So the state I'm in now, I guess I should probably just take some time out and recover.
My dad said that I'll read this and then I'm going to ask you about your promotion for this book. My dad says in Entry Island, he loved how you wrote about the clearances.
Yeah.
He found it bad that the families responsible for them still had their lands and took no responsibility for what happened.
Well, it's true. It's generations on now. The clearances, that was the whole inspiration and the whole motivation for writing Entry Island. I wanted to write about the clearances. I had no idea what I was going to write or how I was going to write it, because the clearances are something that happened in history in the 18th, 19th century in Scotland. And I never got taught about that in history at school. It just wasn't on the curriculum. and I didn't learn about it until I saw a theatre play as a young adult that dealt with the subject of the clearances, and I had known nothing about it, and at that point did a bit of reading and a bit of research and discovered what that was all about. And so that, that had always been somewhere in the back of my mind that I should write about that. But the problem is, how do you write about something? I'm a crime writer. How do I write about, something that happened in, the past, a social phenomenon? You could say it was a crime, but it was a crime on a giant scale. I mean, it was an appalling thing. These poor people forced out of their homes and their villages and made to move initially to other parts of the country, where they were left shivering on cliffs and seeking shelter in caves, and then as it became the clearers became more sophisticated, they started gathering them and putting them on ships and sending them off to North America and down to Australia, New Zealand, and they cleared, hundreds of thousands of people off their land. So it was a big problem. How do I tell that story? And of course, my solution in the end was to have a modern day crime that had echoes going back historically to the clearances. And so I would write in 2 timelines, which I'd done previously, but never with such a big gap, like 150 years. But it was that was interesting too, because it took me, my researches, into the clearances and what happened to those families who'd been cleared off their lands and put on boats. That led me to Canada and to Quebec and to the Madeline Islands and to Entry Island and discovering. It was very interesting going to. There's an area of Quebec called the Western Townships, which are almost exclusively populated by descendants of people from the clearances, Scots. And there's even a town called Stornoway in these townships. And I went to quite a number of them and visited the graveyards. And you walk through the graveyards and they're all names like MacLeod and, Mackenzie. They're all Scottish names, and they would refer back to their origins, the Isle of Harris or the Isle of Lewis. And it was moving and it was disturbing, and it made me all the more determined to write something significant in that story. I think, touch wood, it came off. And has been very successful.
It really did. For this book tour, you're in the UK soon?
Yes, I fly to London on Monday. Sunday. And I'm in London from till the following Friday, with the exception of Wednesday. I go to Bath. I'm doing an event in Bath, and then the London end, it's all about doing media stuff. It's doing press and radio and TV interviews. I think I'm on Sky News Breakfast a week tomorrow, about 8:45. So they can watch out for me there. I'll be talking about the book. And then flying up to Stirling and the Bloody Scotland Crime Festival, where I'm headlining on the Saturday night. And on the Sunday, I go to a place called Strathblane, which is near Glasgow, to do an event at Scotland's first community library. This is a library where the locals raised the money themselves and designed and built this library. It's a fabulous facility, and it has a function room and all the rest of it. And it was a friend of mine, an old friend of mine, going way back to journalist days in the 70s, who'd been the kind of motivating figure behind all this, and he asked me if I would do an event there. So I said, of course. And so they've sold out, and there's a waiting list. So I do that on the Sunday, and then it's Glasgow on the Monday, Perth on the Tuesday, Inverness on the Wednesday, Stornoway on the Thursday, and Edinburgh on the Friday. So I'm doing like something like seven events on consecutive days. It's quite a schedule. If I'm in one piece at the end of it, I'll be very happy.
That's yeah, it's a bit like being on tour as the band.
Oh yeah, probably worse, because you don't. Yeah, I mean, I've toured with bands, and you don't. It's not night after night after night after night. There's usually a break between gigs, but this is night after night after night after night. So it's it's going to be tough going, but the good thing about all that is you get to meet a lot of your readers. People turn out in big numbers for these events, and that's always very rewarding. You get to sign people's books and talk to them, and I also get to meet a lot of old friends touring in Scotland, and so the event that we're going to do in Stornoway, which is going to be in Lewes Castle, so that's the big castle that sits overlooking the inner harbour in Stornoway. It's in the ballroom there, and an old friend, Anna Murray, and her husband are going to play a song. It's a Dubliners song, and it's about the last whale. It was just the last time we did an event up there, they performed a couple of songs. In fact, they've done on several of my events on the island. They've done musical interludes, which is great, because that's very much part of the culture up there. The music, the Celtic music, and so that always works very well. And so yeah, I'm looking forward to meeting up with them. My old friend who built the community library, I'll meet lots of old friends in Glasgow. Always come to the events. That's where I'm from. That's where I grew up. And it's always interesting. A couple of years ago, I was doing an event at the bookstore in Edinburgh, and after it, I was signing books, and there was quite a long line. And as the line was diminishing, I noticed there was a kind of elderly chap standing at the back who's kind of hanging back and not coming forward until everybody else had had their book signed. Then he came forward and he said, "Do you remember me?" And I looked at him and I thought, "No." And it turned out he'd been a great mate of mine when I was at college, aged 18, in Edinburgh, when I'd trained as a journalist. And that's the first time I'd seen him since then. How long ago was that? 55 years or something, and more than half a century anyway. So, when you return to your old stomping grounds, you tend to meet people who emerge from your past, and that's always fun.
Well, Patricia and Donna are both going to bloody Scotland.
Oh, great.
Great. So they said they'll meet you there.
Good. I look forward to that.
Yeah. Patsy's a really big supporter of our Scottish author contingent. Who's going, so that's a good one. I ask everyone on my author chats what they have been reading recently and really enjoying.
Recently, what I've been reading is research material. Last 2 years, I was reading all about climate change and the weather, and then I was all about whales and salmon and all sorts of stuff. So fiction has been well down the list, but before I get into all that research reading, I was reading the Slow Horses series, which I liked very much indeed. I mean, I I'd started reading them a few years back, and then I kind of got hooked on them, and really, really, really enjoyed them. And unusually, I really enjoyed the TV adaptations of them, because very often, TV adaptations of the books are not very faithful to the original. They kind of go off at tangents, and the casting isn't right. And one of the reasons I'd never really wanted to have my books adapted for the screen. But I think the Slow Horses series has been so faithful to the books, and the casting has been so absolutely spot on. Mick Herron must be absolutely delighted with them. I've met Mick a couple of times, both in person and online. Lovely, lovely guy, great writer. I really enjoy that series.
That's a good recommendation. A lot of people do enjoy that series. This version of the Black Lock, before I ask you to kind of recap it for our readers, because we've only got a few minutes, is the first time as well in a book where I've read the use of the term ghillie.
A ghillie? Really?
Yeah, I know what one is because my actual surname, my old surname, is Gilchrist, which is Scottish. So I didn't know what the word was, but it's the first time I've come across it in a book.
Right. Well, yeah. Well, ghillies generally work on Scottish estates and work as assistants to the gamekeepers and the water bailiffs, and they're just involved in all the management of the estate, out in the field, fishing, and everything that's involved in the woods and the animals, and good Scottish word.
It is, yeah. Well, I've got Scottish ancestry, so I think that's where the name comes from. So with the 3 minutes that we've got left, so we've got Where You're Going. Remind people what they're going to go away and have on pre-order, because it comes out on the 12th. Does the Black Lock?
That's right. Yes. It's revisiting Finn and Marsley from the Lewis trilogy, returning to the Isle of Lewis, bringing them back after a 12-year absence for Finn to investigate a murder of which his son has been accused. So it's quite a traumatic return for both of them, and there are all sorts of family pressures involved in that, largely because neither they nor we are sure whether he did it or not. So, I mean, that's the whole basis of the book. Did Fionla kill this girl, or did he not? And that's what Finn and Marshall have to deal with. They have to deal with the doubts. They don't want to believe he did it, but the evidence is mounting against him. So it's quite an emotional roller coaster of a story, I think.
Oh, it definitely is. You could also read it without having read the previous trilogy, though. I think it does stand alone.
Yes, I mean, I did endeavour to make it absolutely standalone, which meant I had to do a little bit of recapping of their history, but I tried to do that as quickly and subtly as possible in the introducing the new story. But I don't think I was careful in the writing of the Black Lock not to give away anything really that happened in the previous book, so that if people haven't read the trilogy and they enjoy the Black Lock, they can go back without having had any spoilers and read the trilogy.
Which must be quite a tricky job to have done, especially because you wrote the trilogy so long ago.
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, I'd probably forgotten as much of the trilogy as I remember. Particularly when you consider the Black House, which I wrote in 2004. So that's 20 years ago. 20 years ago. I can hardly believe it's that long ago. So detail escapes you. So maybe that's a good thing. Because I don't reread books. I did revisit. I have revisited all of my books, but not by rereading them, by listening to the audio versions, which I find quite interesting from a writer's point of view. Listening to your work being read is quite good because you kind of learn what works and what doesn't work. I've been very fortunate that all my books now have been read by a Scottish actor called Peter Forbes, who I think is absolutely superb, and his voice for me has become the voice of my books. So that's how I revisit or have revisited my books. I'm looking forward to listening to the audio version of The Black Loch. Because Peter, being the good professional that he is, took the book with him before recording the audio and went up to the islands and went and visited the locations and talked to people that I had talked to. And so was getting an absolute first-hand sense of the location and the characters. And I bet there are not many readers of audiobooks who do that. So hats off to him.
Yeah, that's really impressive. And then we are at our time, so all that's left for me to say is thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's been a great pleasure.